At that point in time, Pharaoh threw his cupbearer and his baker into jail. Both have dreams, and Joseph goes to them and said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." This really is a crucial question because it indicates that as baffled and perplexed as Joseph was, he had not lost trust in God. Just the reverse. Joseph witnesses to those men about the fact that not only was God able to do the impossible, but that he would do it, which must have sounded a little bit hollow to these men, since Joseph was testifying to God's power, a power which apparently didn't seem to have worked for Joseph. In essence, the dreams meant that Pharaoh would reinstate the cupbearer and kill the chief baker. Then just look at what Joseph says to the cupbearer in chapter 40 and from verse 14. "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried away from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in the dungeon." How human is that? How incredibly Christian is that? Perhaps a good word from the cupbearer would result in Joseph being released from jail. In other words, he was doing what we all do. He was relying upon somebody other than God to effect his deliverance, whereas we ought to continue to rely on God for his deliverance. We can also see that Joseph still hadn't come to terms with the fickleness and betrayal of his brothers. He insists that he shouldn't have been in Egypt in the first place, let alone in an Egyptian jail. So how does all of this turn out? Well, we're told in verse 20 that now the third day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of his chief cupbearers and chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that once again he put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. He forgot Joseph for 2 full years. And of all the things that Joseph had suffered, this must have been one of the most painful. Forgotten by the man he had rescued. Joseph must have felt real fury and self-pity and bitterness. And what of Jesus, who was forgotten and forsaken by his precious disciples when it really mattered? Well, in the end, complete forgiveness, as they acknowledged their desertion of Jesus. The 4th episode in Joseph's life involves favor by Pharaoh. Favor by Pharaoh. In the barest outlines, Pharaoh had a series of weird dreams. The cupbearer remembered, and Pharaoh called for Joseph to interpret the dreams. And again, Joseph gives evidence of his continued faith in God in spite of his perplexity. And as a reward, Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of collecting the grain during the 7 years of plenty and distributing it during the 7 years of drought. During this time of being in charge of Egypt's food supply, Joseph receives great consolation. In chapter 41 and from verse 50 we read, "Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, and he said, 'It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household.' The second son he named Ephraim, and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." He had come to terms with the fact of his brother's betrayal of him and what they had done to him, and he had prospered in the land of his suffering. But there is no denying the haunting anguish which he still felt as he gave his children those names. Fifthly and finally, we learn of Joseph's forgiveness of his brothers. His forgiveness of his brothers. The drought begins to bite, and Joseph's brothers are in Canaan, and they're beginning to starve, and so they come down to Egypt to buy grain. Now Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize Joseph. Nevertheless, he sends them grain, and he starts playing sort of mind games with them. He ensures that they return a second time to Egypt, and this time he makes himself known to them. And that is recorded in chapter 45, verses 1 through 9. It says, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, 'Have everyone leave my presence.' So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Is my father still living?' But his brothers were unable to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. And then Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come close to me.' And when they had done so, he said, 'I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me and don't delay.' Joseph is totally overcome with emotion at being reunited with his brothers. He's got over his anger, and of crucial importance is the fact that by this time he had come to terms with his brother's treachery. And of even greater importance is the fact that by this time Joseph had come to understand God's plan for himself. To be sure, he had suffered unmeasurable anguish, as had Jesus while he was on earth, but it had been according to God's plan the whole time in order to save lives. He correctly declares, so then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And this had always been God's plan. And Joseph had suffered great perplexity while God had been at work in Joseph to ensure that he was in a fit spiritual state to fulfill God's purposes. Jesus, on the other hand, had known all about the purposes of God right from the beginning, what God's will was and what his objective was. And yet he suffered immeasurably in every way as he followed every step of the Father's way, including his substitutionary death on the cross, as the means by which God would forgive sins in the future. In Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, at the very end of this story, Joseph says to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Satan and the human race have, by and large, intended to harm Jesus. But by following God's plan, Jesus has accomplished the inconceivable, the saving of many eternal lives. So what are we to make of the coronavirus? Well, I believe the lesson that's come through here is that we are to consider it part of God's plan to do something extraordinarily loving in bringing many, many people to the place of forgiveness at this time. And concerning the coronavirus and as it relates to ourselves and our lockdown, what we are meant to do is persevere in faith. Now, I fully realize that to persevere in faith, as Joseph did, might involve us in a whole number of things which cause us pain or bewilderment or even try our faith. Is this really from God? Is God really in control? But we are to assume God's control and we are to continue on in faith. We need to remember that we walk by faith and not by sight. And so, if ever we are to play our role in the unfolding of God's will at this time, then what we need to do is follow the model of Joseph. He goes through all the pain, all the confusion, all the anxiety, all the bewilderment, and yet he continues trusting God. He knows God has not abandoned him. He can't understand what God's doing, but by the end of the story, by the end of Joseph's life, he'd reached the point of understanding that God had used him to redeem many, 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 I assume millions of people by getting him into the position where he was 2IC to Pharaoh. He was a young man at the age of 17 to begin with, at the bottom of a well. And at the end of the story, he is 2IC to Pharaoh in Egypt. And he, in doing so, has played his role in the plan of God. And so for us, we don't know what God has planned. But the only way in which we will find out what God's plan is for our lives and what role we can play in it is by going on in faith, in spite of the obstacles and the difficulties, looking to God to take us on to the next chapter. Thank you. Let's pray together. Oh God, I thank you that you have a place for all of us in your plans. And I pray at this time that you would open our eyes and understanding that we might see what you want us to be doing, to know what it is that you would have us involved in. And Lord, that in all things, filled with your Spirit, we might lead many to salvation. Amen.